Good afternoon, students. This is Saraswati KB, Associate Professor, Government First Aid College, Tiptur. This is the concluding session of the poetry section on romanticism. I'll brief here the important features and factors that influenced this period of literature. Romanticism was a broad movement in the history of European and American consciousness which rebelled against the triumph of the European Enlightenment. It is also a comprehensive term for the large number of tendencies towards changes observable in European literature in the later 18th and early 19th centuries. As an ageless phenomenon, Romanticism cannot be defined. The Romantic movement is traditionally seen as starting roughly around 1780. However, the Romantic period, more exactly, denotes the span between the year 1798, the year in which William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge published the collection of poems entitled Lyrical Ballads, and 1838, the year in which the novelist Sir Walter Scott died, and the other main writers of the early century were either dead or no longer productive, and the first reform bills passed in Parliament. Romanticism as a literary period in England, from the American Rebellion through the first Reform Bill of 1832, has to be defined as a high Romantic age. Romanticism manifested at somewhat varied times in Britain, America, France, Germany, and Italy. Romanticism affected arts and culture in general. Its main feature was reaction against 18th century and the age of reason. It was a reaction against the rationalism of the 18th century, the view of the physical world increasingly dominated by science, and the mental world by the theories of John Locke and the neoclassicism of the Enlightenment. During the Romantic period, changes in various fields took place in philosophy, politics, religion, literature, painting, and music. All these changes were represented, articulated, and symbolized by the English Romantic poets. In literature, reason was attacked because it was no longer considered wholly satisfying by the Romantic poets, and before them, even by the Augustan satirists themselves. The Romantic period coincided with the French Revolution, which was to some extent seen as a political enactment of the ideas of Romanticism, which at the beginning involved breaking out of the restrictive patterns and models of the past. This period saw the end of the dominance of the Renaissance tradition and the fragmentation of consciousness away from the cultural authority of classical Rome. Local cultures were rediscovered in Europe, and flowering of vernacular literatures took place. In Britain, Thomas Gray had explored Celtic and Norse literature other than the classical, which had influenced English. The classical inheritance had little influence in ballads, folk songs, and folk literature. The main aspects of Romanticism in the 18th century were nature. An increasing interest in nature and in the natural, primitive, and uncivilized way of life. Growing interest in scenery, especially its more untamed and disorderly manifestations. An association of human moods with the moods of nature, and so a subjective feeling for it and interpretation of it. Romantic nature poems are meditative poems on whose scenes the poet raises an emotional problem or personal crisis. Emphasize on the need for spontaneity in thought and action and in expression of thought. Increasing importance attached to natural genius and the power of imagination. Tendency to exalt the individual and his needs and emphasize on the need for a freer and more personal expression. The poet emerged as a person endowed with a specially kind of faculty which set him apart from his fellow men. The romantic poet assumes the mantle of a prophet, seer, and legislator. The new visionary poets wanted to reconstruct the grounds of hope, announcing the coming of time when a renewed humanity will inhabit a renewed world. The imagination in the Romantic period was raised from being simply the faculty for creating fictions, pleasing perhaps, but not necessarily true, to a method of apprehending and communicating truth. The poet became an artist and a prophet. Instincts, emotions, and the heart, rather than reason, intellect, and head, are trusted. The Romantics expose their own souls, directing the light of analysis and comment internally. The Romantics believed only in themselves. Human beings refuse to submit to limitations and persist in setting infinite and inaccessible goals. The invasion of the inner recesses of the personality was continued in the analysis of dreams and the irrational in drug taking and interest in the occult. There was a fascination for the private lives of individuals which reflected autobiographical works. The figure of the romantic hero, a compound of guilt and superhuman greatness, who could not be defeated by death, and like a satanic hero, successfully defied and the demons, was variously dealt with in poems and literary works. The romantic hero was either a solitary dreamer hero or an egocentric plagued with guilt and remorse, separated from society because he has rejected it or because it has rejected him. It was also introduced the theme of exile, of the disinherited mind that could not find a spiritual home in its native land and society or anywhere in the modern world. For the Romantic society, evil force cruelly moulding and dwarfing its citizens. The Romantic poets, on the whole, fled from the country, city, and turned to nature. For them, it was nature rather than society that was man's proper setting. Man needed to help of nature to fulfill himself. They believed that society and civilization corrupted humanity's natural innocence and instinct for good. Children were seen as holier and purer objects than adult people because they were unspoiled by civilization and uncorrupted. Children had a state to be envied, cultivated, enhanced, and admired. Poetry sees man in communion with the natural world rather than with other men. There was shift in religious ideas. Many writers failed to find Christianity satisfying. There was search for spiritual reality which Orthodox Christianity did not appear to supply. In this search, the more visionary writers of Romantic period drew on Platonism and Neoplatonism and various forms of dissenting Christianity. Many of their poems were built around this search. Personal experience was emphasized and accompanied by deepening sense of history, which found expression in historical novels. Industrialization was perceived as a threat and an evil against people and society. French Revolution affected the older Romantic generation of poets with its ideas of democracy and its action of breaking with the past. In fact, humble life was seriously presented in a language really spoken by rustic people. The contrast and distinction between new Romantic period and classical age can be stressed. Classicists considered the Industrial Revolution from a positive point of view as an event creating wealth and modernization. It was also believed that civilization, as accomplished in Greek and Roman times, was also within the grasp of their neoclassical age. The main romantic features was the influence of pre-romantics like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and William Blake. Rousseau advocated virtuous simplicity in place of civilization of art and science. He ridiculed the idea of scientific progress and speculative philosophy and appealed to the human heart and voice of consciousness. The essay on the origin of the inequality among men described man in a state of nature like a noble animal, free of disease, naked, and without all superfluities. Rousseau set the idea of savage man with natural compassion, which was the pure emotion of nature, prior to all kinds of reflection, against Hobbes' view of man as naturally wicked. Romantic period saw the emergence of first and second romantic generation of poets. The first generation included Blake, Wordsworth, and Coleridge. The second generation is represented by Lord Byron, Shelley, and Keats. At the end of the 18th and beginning of 19th century, we distinguish two generations of romantic poets. First generations of poets were young and affected by the influence of French revolutionary ideals of democracy. The period of the French Terror and the rise of Napoleon definitely disappointed them and therefore retreated into reaction. The second group were less lucky than the older poets. Their society was dominated by the repression of the Troy governments at home, apprehensive that every request for freedom might become a cause of revolution. The 18th century society, regarded as a great work of man, ideally holding all social classes together in mutually supporting harmony, became a repressive, dark, organized body, limiting and crushing human souls. This is in detail the concluding part of Romantic Age. This goes in answering the history section of your exam paper. In the history section, which is prescribed for your study, there will be 1 marks questions which will be based on the history of Romantic period. I wish you all the best and thank you.